It was the first night of my hospital internship, and I was nervous. My name is Jamie, and I just started at St. Vincent's General Hospital, an old building with a rich history in the heart of the city. The hospital had been around for over 100 years, with several additions and renovations, and it had its fair share of ghost stories. Nurses and doctors told tales of strange sightings, lights flickering in empty rooms, and eerie sounds at night. But I'd never believed in ghosts, or so I thought. For my first shift, I was assigned to the night watch. It sounded easy enough, just making rounds, checking on patients, and helping anyone who needed it. But when I got my assignment, my heart sank. I was assigned to the East Wing, also known as the Old Wing. The Old Wing was rarely used anymore, except in emergencies or when the other wards were full. Most of the time, it stayed empty, with only a few patients in critical care. The rooms were dimly lit, and the air felt stale, as if it hadn't moved in years. I was handed a flashlight, a set of keys, and a walkie-talkie by the head nurse, who gave me a strange look. "Stay alert," she said, her voice low. "You'll be alone in there tonight. If you hear anything strange, just keep calm." I laughed nervously, thinking she was trying to scare me, but her expression remained serious. I nodded and took a deep breath, trying to shake off my anxiety as I walked toward the East Wing. Entering the wing, the door creaked as I opened it, echoing down the long, empty corridor. My footsteps sounded louder than usual, bouncing off the walls and filling the silence. I could see the rooms lined up on each side, their doors half open, with beds neatly made and curtains drawn. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into darkness. At first, I checked the patient rooms one by one. The few patients in this wing were mostly asleep, their heart monitors beeping softly. I felt a bit more relaxed seeing them. The place was spooky, yes, but they were real people. As long as I wasn't completely alone, I thought I'd be okay. But after an hour, the wing started feeling colder and the silence grew heavier. I noticed my flashlight flickered a few times, the beam of light growing weaker. I tapped it, hoping it wasn't dying already. Just as I thought it was back to normal, the light dimmed completely. The hallway plunged into darkness. "Perfect timing," I muttered, fumbling with the flashlight and shaking it to get it working again. Just then I heard it, a soft whisper, almost like a breath, coming from down the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding. I held my breath, listening. It was faint but unmistakable, a voice, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. I glanced around, hoping another nurse was playing a prank, but I remembered I was alone in the wing. I took a shaky breath and told myself it was just my imagination. After all, the Old Wing had a reputation for strange sounds. Probably just the pipes, I thought. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound got louder, closer, and clearer. "Help me," the whisper said, barely audible but chilling. I felt a shiver run down my spine. My hands trembled as I gripped the flashlight, and I forced myself to step forward. I'd been trained to help patients no matter what. If someone needed me, I couldn't just ignore them. The first encounter, the voice seemed to come from room 203, a room at the end of the hall. I walked toward it, feeling like I was moving through thick fog. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open, peering inside. The room was empty. "Hello?" I called softly, my voice barely a whisper. I turned on the room light, which flickered before casting a dim, sickly yellow glow. The bed was empty, sheets neatly folded, as if no one had been there in a long time. I checked the patient log. Room 203 was unoccupied. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the dread creeping over me. It was just my mind playing tricks on me, I told myself. Or maybe I was just hearing things. But as I turned to leave, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. In the reflection of the small mirror above the sink, there was a figure. A woman stood behind me, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her mouth opened, forming words, though no sound came out. I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and she was gone. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of the sink, trying to steady myself. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I felt dizzy, the room spinning around me, and I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. Instead, I forced myself to step out of the room, heart hammering, and shut the door behind me. The second encounter. I walked down the hallway again, feeling like I was in a nightmare. The air felt colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on me. Every shadow seemed to move, and the whispering continued, growing louder, filling my ears until it was all I could hear. The walkie-talkie crackled, breaking the silence. "Jamie?" It was the head nurse's voice, but it sounded faint, like she was far away. "Yes?" I answered, my voice shaky. There was no response, only static. I tried calling again, but the static grew louder, almost deafening, until it suddenly stopped. Then, in the silence, I heard the voice again. "She's here," the voice whispered, close to my ear. I felt a cold breath on my neck, and I turned around, but no one was there. I started to run, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out of the old wing. The whispers grew louder, turning into voices, pleading, crying, begging for help. I clutched my ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, filling my head until I thought I would go mad. As I reached the door at the end of the hall, I saw her again, the woman from room 203. She stood in front of the door, blocking my way. Her eyes were wide, filled with pain, and her lips moved silently as if trying to tell me something. "Please," she whispered, her voice a soft, haunting echo. "Don't leave me here." I stumbled back, tears streaming down my face, unable to speak. The door behind her slowly creaked open, revealing darkness beyond. The woman stepped aside, pointing to the open door, her face twisted in sorrow. I don't know what made me do it, but I stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the darkness. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into blackness, the whispers surrounding me, growing louder, until I was screaming, lost in the dark. I've worked at Ridgeway Hospital for 2 years, and strange things have happened before, but I always brush them off. Hospitals are places of life and death, and sometimes you see things you can't explain. But what happened in room 304 still haunts me. It was a busy day shift, bright sunlight streaming through the windows, and patients and visitors bustling through the hallways. I was going about my routine, checking vitals and bringing in lunch trays. The hospital felt alive, with people chatting and the usual hum of machines and beeping monitors. It was the kind of day when you wouldn't expect anything creepy or out of the ordinary. Then I got a call from the front desk about room 304. The patient, Mr. Landry, had been checked in that morning. I remembered him, an elderly man with a kind face. He'd come in for a minor surgery and was supposed to be recovering well, but the desk clerk said Mr. Landry was asking for me specifically, though I hadn't met him before that morning. I headed to his room, expecting to find a routine request. But when I opened the door to room 304, something felt off. Mr. Landry was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling with a blank expression. I stepped closer, and his eyes slowly turned toward me, but they looked different, clouded, distant, almost as if he was looking through me. "Mr. Landry, are you feeling okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly lifted his hand and pointed to the far corner of the room. "There's something here with me," he whispered, barely audible. I looked to where he was pointing, but nothing was there, just the plain hospital walls and a curtain around the bed. I brushed it off, thinking maybe he was confused or just groggy from his medication. "It's okay, Mr. Landry," I said. "You're safe here. Try to get some rest." He looked back at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Fear? Desperation? It made my skin crawl. "Can you please check the closet?" he whispered. "It's watching me." A chill ran through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I opened the closet door and found it empty, just like I expected. "Nothing's here, Mr. Landry," I assured him, smiling to ease his worry. "You're alone." He didn't look relieved. Instead, his face twisted into something almost like horror, and he clenched his hands around his blanket. "Don't lie to me," he murmured. "I saw it, standing in the corner." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. There was something so haunting in his voice that I couldn't ignore it. I tried to reassure him, telling him I'd come back to check on him soon. But as I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Please, don't let it take me," he whispered, his voice cracking. I nodded, more to calm him down than anything. and promised I'd keep an eye out. But as I left the room, I felt a heavy sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I tried to distract myself by focusing on my other patients, but every time I passed by room 304, I had this strange urge to go back in. Around noon, I returned to Mr. Landry's room to check his vitals, but he was different, pale and cold, lying still in his bed. When I approached, his breathing was slow and shallow, and his eyes were fixed on the same spot in the corner of the room. His lips moved, barely whispering something I couldn't understand. "Mr. Landry?" I called, leaning closer to hear him, but his voice was so faint, almost a mumble. Then I heard it, just one word: "Help." I leaned in, trying to hear him better, but at that moment I felt something strange. A sudden drop in temperature, like I'd just stepped into an icebox. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing down on me. Goosebumps rose on my arms and my heart began to race. "Please," he whispered again, his eyes still fixed on that corner. I looked back, half expecting to see something this time. But again, there was nothing there. I left the room quickly, feeling that strange chill still clinging to me. I told another nurse about it, but she just gave me a funny look and told me Mr. Landry was probably confused from the anesthesia. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Later that afternoon, I heard a loud crash from down the hall, near room 304. I rushed over and found his door wide open. Mr. Landry was standing in the middle of the room, staring blankly at the corner, his hands trembling. His IV pole was knocked over, and his blankets were scattered across the floor. "Mr. Landry," I called out, stepping toward him, but he didn't move. He just kept staring, his eyes wide with terror. Then he started to back away, his gaze fixed on that same corner, as if he could see something I couldn't. He backed up until he hit the wall, and then he slowly slid to the floor, muttering over and over, "It's here, it's here." We tried to calm him down, but he wouldn't respond to anyone. He just kept mumbling, his eyes still locked on that empty corner. Within an hour, Mr. Landry's heart rate started to drop, and no matter what we did, we couldn't stabilize him. I held his hand as he took his last breath, his eyes never leaving that corner, a look of pure horror frozen on his face. After he passed, I left the room, feeling like I'd been holding my own breath the entire time. As I walked down the hall, I glanced back into room 304. The corner he'd been staring at seemed darker, like a shadow lingering there, just out of sight. I never went back into room 304 after that day. Even now, every time I pass by that door, I feel a chill. I don't know what Mr. Landry saw, but I believe him. Whatever it was, it's still there, waiting. My name is Grace. I've always wanted to help people, so I became a nurse. Last month, I started my first night shift at St. Mary's Hospital. I'd heard strange stories about the hospital, whispers about ghosts and haunted halls, but I thought it was just old gossip. I'd never been afraid of the dark or of working alone, so I wasn't worried until I experienced it myself. The hospital is huge and very old, with cold, long hallways that echo even the smallest sounds. On that first night shift, I felt nervous but determined. Everything seemed normal until I noticed a door at the end of a dim hallway. It was old, wooden, and a bit scratched up. There was a sign that said, "No entry, restricted." The hallway was darker there, and no one else seemed to go near. As I worked that night, I kept glancing down the hallway, feeling like something was waiting. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just a locked room, probably for storage. But the feeling wouldn't go away. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise, like faint whispers, coming from that direction. I stopped what I was doing and listened, thinking maybe another nurse was calling me. But when I looked, no one was there. The whispers started to sound more like crying, and my heart began to race. I thought about ignoring it, but something inside me felt drawn to that door. I knew I shouldn't, but I slowly walked toward it, my footsteps echoing down the hallway. As I got closer, the crying grew louder, like someone was just on the other side begging for help. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold, and for a second, I thought about turning back. But then I heard a weak, raspy voice whisper, "Help me." I couldn't ignore it. I turned the knob, and to my surprise, it opened. Inside was a dark, empty hallway that smelled like old medicine and mold. I could barely see anything, but I felt something in the air, something heavy. As I took a step forward, the door slammed shut behind me, leaving me alone in the dark. My flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but I could see faded signs on the walls pointing to Ward 9. I'd never heard of Ward 9. It wasn't listed on any of the maps or training materials I'd seen. I should have turned back, but I was drawn in, almost like something was pulling me. I followed the hallway, the air growing colder with every step. I could hear soft murmurs, whispers echoing off the walls. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my eyes, but when I turned, there was nothing there. My breathing grew shallow, but I kept walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence. At the end of the hall, I found a single hospital bed with old, torn sheets. There was a figure lying on it, a woman, pale and frail, with eyes wide open, staring straight at the ceiling. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized she was mouthing the same word, over and over. I stepped closer, feeling an overwhelming sadness and fear that I couldn't explain. Her hand slowly lifted, pointing to a door on the other side of the room. The door was covered in dust, with strange symbols scratched into the wood. I felt a surge of panic, but I couldn't turn away. I reached for the door, my hand shaking, and opened it. Inside was a room filled with old hospital equipment, like something from decades ago. But it wasn't the equipment that terrified me. It was the rows of patient files on the shelves, each one covered in dust, forgotten. The name at the top of each file was the same, Sarah Thompson. There were at least 20 files, each with the same photo, a woman who looked exactly like the figure on the bed. I backed away, my heart racing. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and bony. I turned around, and there she was, the woman from the bed, standing right behind me, her eyes empty and hollow. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, and I felt a cold wind rush through me, as if she was trying to pull me into the darkness with her. I ran, stumbling through the hallway, my breath coming in gasps. The whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls, filling my head until I thought I would go mad. I reached the door at the end of the hallway and threw it open, bursting back into the brightly lit hallway of the main hospital. When I turned around, the door was closed, and the hallway behind it was gone. I asked the other nurses about the wing I'd seen, about Ward 9 and the woman on the bed. They looked at me strangely, saying there was no Ward 9. The area at the end of that hall was shut down years ago, they said, and nobody was allowed. But I know what I saw, and every night I feel her presence, waiting in that forgotten wing, calling for help that no one else can hear.